the vast, unforgiving heart of the Montana Territory, a man with a soul as hard as the winter ground, made a deal to save his legacy. David Blackwood, a rancher chained by a painful past, needed a wife, any wife, to fulfill his father's will. In St. Louis, a city of gilded cages, Sienna Vance, a woman with nothing left but her pride, saw his cold proposition as her only escape from ruin. It was a simple contract, her name, in exchange for his protection. A marriage of convenience. But neither could foresee the fire that would ignite from such cold ashes, a fire that would either forge a new future or burn everything they knew to the ground. This is the story of how a simple bargain became the fight of their lives. The air in Mr. Abernathy's dusty law office in Promise Creek, Montana, was thick with the scent of old paper and stale cigar smoke. It was a smell David Blackwood associated with death and obligation. He stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of blue sky over the distant sawtooth peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. His jaw was a hard line, his shoulders set like granite. At 32, his face was already a testament to a hard life etched by sun and wind and haunted by a sorrow he never spoke of. "It's as plain as the nose on your face, David Elias Abernathy," said his voice, a dry rustle. The old lawyer adjusted his spectacles and tapped a gnarled finger on the last will and testament of Jebediah Blackwood. "Your father was a stubborn man. He wanted to see the Blackwood name continue on Blackwood Creek Ranch. You have until the first snows of winter, 6 months at most, to take a wife. A legal binding marriage. If you fail to do so," he let the words hang in the air. I know David bit out his voice a low growl. "The entire ranch, lock, stock, and barrel is forfeited. Half goes to the territory, and the other half—" He couldn't bring himself to say the name. "To Mr. Lucas, Thorne Abernathy finished for him." A muscle ticked in David's jaw. Lucas Thorne, a man whose charm was as thin as a layer of ice over black water. Thorne had been his father's bitterest rival for decades, slowly buying up land and water rights, trying to choke Blackwood Creek from every direction. The thought of Thorne setting foot in his father's house, walking the land his family had bled for, was a poison in his gut. "There must be another way," David said, turning from the window. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no room for negotiation. "There is not," Abernathy said gently. "But I may have a solution. Not a pleasant one, perhaps, but a solution nonetheless." He rummaged through a pile of correspondence, pulling out a letter with delicate, slanted handwriting. "I have a contact in St. Louis, a colleague. He informed me of the unfortunate passing of a client, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Her niece, a Miss Sienna. Vance has been left in a precarious position. She is educated, of good character, and utterly alone." David scoffed. "You want me to mail order a bride like some desperate sodbuster? This is not that, David. This is a proposition. A business arrangement," Abernathy clarified. "Miss Vance is in debt, hounded by creditors after her aunt's passing. She needs security, a safe harbor. You need a wife, a name on a legal document. You could offer her a marriage of convenience, a partnership in name only. You provide her with a home and safety. She provides you with the signature you need to save your ranch." David considered it. The idea was distasteful clinical. Love and marriage were ghosts in his life, specters of a past he had buried deep. He had no heart left to give a woman, and he had no desire to pretend. But the alternative was losing everything. He thought of the scent of pine after a rainstorm on his land, the lowing of his cattle at dawn, the weight of the legacy his father had left him. It was more than land. It was his identity. Write to her, David said, his voice void of emotion. Tell her the terms, no sentiment. This is a contract. She will have her own room, her own life. She will want for nothing material. In return, she will be Mrs. Blackwood on paper and in public. Nothing more. 500 miles away, in the humid, cloying heat of St. Louis, Sienna Vance folded the letter from her late aunt's lawyer for the 10th time. The paper was already soft with wear. Penniless. The word echoed in the cramped, stuffy confines of her boarding-house room. Her aunt's dress shop had been mortgaged to the hilt, and upon her death the creditors had descended like vultures. All Sienna had left were a few trunks of books, clothes, and a mountain of someone else's debt. Worse than the debt was the owner of it, Mr. Sterling, the boarding-house proprietor. A portly man with damp hands and eyes that lingered far too long, he had made his own proposition. He would forgive the debt he'd purred if she would agree to become his companion. The unspoken meaning had left her feeling soiled. A knock on the door made her jump. It was Mr. Abernathy's letter, the one that had arrived that morning from Montana. She had read it in disbelief. A marriage of convenience. To a rancher she'd never met. The terms were as cold and stark as the mountains she imagined surrounded his home. He offered passage, a home financial security, and a promise of distance. Mr. Blackwood is a man of his word, the lawyer had written. He assures me you will be treated with respect, but requests you understand this is a practical arrangement, not a romantic one. It was madness to bind herself to a stranger, to travel into the wild, untamed West, a place so different from the society she knew. She was a woman who found comfort in poetry and quiet afternoons, not in dust and cattle. But what was her alternative? A life of servitude, or worse, submitting to the lecherous advances of Mr. Sterling. The West was an unknown fear, but Mr. Sterling was a known and present danger. The stranger in Montana offered her a cage of his own making, but it was a large one with a promise of respect. Mr. Sterling offered a slimy, suffocating trap. With trembling hands, she took out a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. Her decision was not born of courage, but of the utter absence of any other choice. She would trade her name for her freedom. She would become Mrs. Blackwood. 2 weeks later, David stood on the platform of the Promise Creek train station. The locomotive hissed and steamed, a great iron beast connecting their remote world to the one back east. He felt a rare flicker of unease. He had seen a photograph Abernathy had procured. Sienna Vance was fine. Brown hair pinned up neatly, a serious face, eyes that seemed too large and intelligent. She looked like a schoolteacher, breakable and out of place. A woman descended the steps, clutching a small valise. She matched the photograph, but it had done her no justice. In person, her posture was straight and proud, despite the weariness in her face. She scanned the small crowd, her gaze uncertain, until her eyes landed on him. He was the only one not moving, watching her with an unnerving intensity. She walked toward him, her city boots already coated in a fine layer of Montana dust. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd expected. "Miss Vance?" he replied, his tone flat. He made no move to take her bag, simply gave a curt nod. "Welcome to Promise Creek. The wagon is this way. The contract is at the lawyer's office. We'll sign it before we head to the ranch." There was no warmth, no welcome. Just business. As Sienna looked into the hard, unyielding face of her future husband, a chilling thought settled in her heart. She had escaped one prison only to walk willingly into another. The wagon ride to Blackwood Creek Ranch was conducted in a near-total suffocating silence. Sienna sat rigidly on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while David handled the team of horses with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the rutted track ahead and the vast, intimidating landscape that swallowed them whole. For Sienna, it was a world away from the manicured parks and cobblestone streets of St. Louis. Here the sky was a character in itself, an immense, overpowering dome of brilliant blue that seemed to press down on the earth. The land rolled on in waves of sun-bleached grass sagebrush and distant hazy mountains that looked like sleeping giants. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt wild and dangerous, as if it could turn on you in an instant. The dust kicked up by the horses coated her dress and clung to her throat. The silence from the man beside her was louder than the rattle of the wagon wheels. Finally, after an hour that felt like a lifetime, he spoke, his voice as dry as the dust. "That's Blackwood Creek," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. "The ranch is just beyond. The homestead, when it came into view, was as stark and uncompromising as its owner. The main house was a large two-story structure made of dark weathered timber, solid and imposing. Several barns and corrals stood nearby, all built for function, not beauty. There were no flowers, no welcoming porch swing, just the raw practical necessities of a working cattle ranch. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress. A grizzled old man with a sweeping white mustache and kind eyes emerged from the largest barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He squinted at the wagon, his gaze landing on Sienna with open curiosity. "David," he said, his voice a friendly rasp. "You're back," Jeb David acknowledged with a nod. "This is Miss Vance. She'll be staying at the house." The hesitation was slight, but Sienna felt it like a physical blow. He couldn't even bring himself to call her his wife. The old man, Jebediah Jeb Stone, tipped his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the ranch." He offered her a genuine smile, the first she'd received since stepping off the train. It was a small kindness that felt like a lifeline. David led her into the house. The inside was a reflection of the outside dark wood, heavy furniture, and an overwhelming sense of masculine emptiness. Animal heads with glassy eyes stared down from the walls, and the air smelled of leather wood smoke and something else. Something like loneliness. It was clean, but it lacked any sense of warmth or comfort. A layer of fine dust covered most surfaces, a battle lost to the persistent Montana wind. "Your room is upstairs." "First door on the left," David stated, setting her trunk down at the base of the staircase with a heavy thud. "My room is at the end of the hall. The kitchen is through there. Jeb's wife, Martha, passed a few years back, so the cooking is handled by the men. It's basic. Don't expect any St. Louis finery." He turned to face her, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His expression was unreadable, closed off. "Let's be clear on the rules, Miss Vance. This is your home, and you will be treated with respect by me and my men. You will want for nothing. Your duties are simple: be present when we go to town, sign any documents Mr. Abernathy requires, and maintain the public appearance of our arrangement. Beyond that, your time is your own. I am out on the range from sunup to sundown. I expect this house to be a place of peace and quiet when I return. I do not want it changed. Is that understood?" The speech was so cold, so transactional, it stole the air from her lungs. She had known it would be this way, but the reality of it was colder than she could have imagined. "I do not want it changed." He wasn't just talking about the furniture. "Perfectly, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, lifting her chin. She would not let him see her fear or her disappointment. "And I would prefer to be addressed as Mrs. Blackwood. It seems prudent, given our arrangement." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even grudging respect, passed through his stormy eyes before it was extinguished. "Fine. Mrs. Blackwood." With that, he turned and walked out the front door, leaving her alone in the cavernous, silent hall. She was Mrs. Blackwood, mistress of a fortress. She wasn't allowed to change. Wife to a man who was a stranger in his own home. The first few weeks were a study in quiet misery. Sienna kept to herself, exploring the house and its small library of her father-in-law's books. She learned the rhythms of the ranch from a distance, the clang of the breakfast bell before dawn, the thunder of hooves as the men rode out, the weary silence that fell after supper, punctuated only by the low murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. David was a ghost in her life. He was gone before she woke, and returned long after dark, eating his meals in exhausted silence before retreating to his study to pore over ledgers. They were two ships passing in the night, sharing a roof, but nothing else. Sienna, however, was not one to sit idle. The dust and neglect of the house began to grate on her. It was a home in desperate need of a heart. One morning, armed with a bucket and rags, she began to clean. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, polished the windows until the fierce Montana sun streamed in, and carefully dusted every surface, every book, every forgotten trinket. David returned that evening and stopped dead in the entryway. The house was transformed. It was still the same space, but it was brighter, cleaner. The air felt lighter. He looked around, his expression tightening. He saw a small vase of wild flowers she'd picked from near the creek, sitting on the mantelpiece. He walked over, picked up the vase, and stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "I told you not to change anything," he said, his voice dangerously low. Sienna stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her heart pounding. "I was merely cleaning, Mr. Blackwood. Tidiness is not a change, it is an improvement. This," he said, gesturing with the vase, "is a change. It's unnecessary." He didn't throw it. He didn't smash it. He did something worse. He walked to the front door, opened it, and gently placed the vase on the porch rail, as if it were an offering to be taken away by the wind. Then he closed the door and walked past her up the stairs, without another word. Sienna watched him go, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. She had known he was a hard man, but she hadn't understood the depth of his commitment to his own misery. He didn't just want a marriage of convenience, he wanted a life of convenience free from any color, any warmth, any intrusion of life itself. And she, it seemed, was the ultimate intrusion. That night, lying in her cold, lonely bed, she wondered if she had the strength to survive, not just the wildness of the land, but the desolate wilderness of the man she had married. Life at Blackwood Creek settled into a fragile, unspoken truce. Sienna continued her quiet campaign to breathe life into the house, but more subtly. She didn't bring in wildflowers again. Instead, she focused on order and warmth. She learned the workings of the large wood-fired stove and began to bake bread. The scent, rich and wholesome, filled the house, a stark contrast to the usual smell of fried bacon and boiled coffee. The ranch hands noticed first. Young Billy, a boy of no more than 17 with a perpetual grin, would tip his hat and thank her profusely for the extra slice of bread she'd wrapped for him. Even the gruff cook, a man named Cookie, whose vocabulary seemed limited to grunts, gave her a nod of approval. They started calling her Mom, not with the stiff formality of their first meeting, but with a growing, genuine respect. David noticed too, though he said nothing. He couldn't miss the smell of baking bread when he came in at night, nor the way the polished floorboards reflected the lamplight. He saw how the men's attitudes toward her were softening. He watched from the corner of his eye as she sat on the porch in the evenings, reading a book, a solitary and graceful figure against the rugged backdrop of his world. He had ordered her not to change things, but she was changing them anyway, not with grand gestures, but with a quiet, persistent presence that was starting to seep into the cracks of his fortified life. The first real crack in his armor appeared on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. A cry of pain from the corral sent Sienna running to the porch. Billy had been working with a young, unbroken colt when it had spooked, kicking out and catching the boy square in the forearm. The sickening crack of bone was audible even from the house. David was there in an instant, his face a mask of controlled urgency. He assessed the situation, his orders sharp and clear as he sent another hand riding for the doctor in Promise Creek, a good 2-hour ride away. Billy was pale, cradling his arm, his face beaded with sweat and tears of pain. The men stood around awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Before David could react, Sienna was there. She moved with a calm purpose that surprised everyone, including herself. "Bring him inside to the kitchen table," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Jeb, fetch me the whiskey from the study and clean linens from the upstairs closet. The cleanest you can find." They looked to David for confirmation. He hesitated for only a second, then gave a sharp nod. "Do as she says." Inside, Sienna worked with practiced efficiency. She had learned basic medicine and tending to injuries during her time as a governess for a large family. She gently cut away Billy's sleeve, her touch surprisingly firm. She cleaned the wound where the skin had broken and had Jeb pour a little whiskey over it, ignoring Billy's hiss of pain. "We need to set it," she said, looking directly at David. "The doctor will be ours. It can't wait." David's eyes widened slightly. "You know how I do," she said simply. "I'll need you to hold him steady. Hold his shoulder. This will hurt." What followed was a moment of intense, focused collaboration. David stood behind Billy, his large, strong hands firmly gripping the boy's shoulder, murmuring words of encouragement. Sienna took a deep breath, her hands finding the brake. With a swift, decisive movement, she pulled and twisted. Billy screamed a raw, sharp sound and then went limp, nearly fainting from the shock and relief. Sienna, her face as pale as Billy's, quickly bound the arm with makeshift splints she'd fashioned from pieces of a wooden crate and torn linen. When it was over, she sank into a chair, the adrenaline leaving her as quickly as it had come. The kitchen was silent, except for Billy's ragged breathing. David looked from the neatly splintered arm to Sienna's face. He had seen her as a fragile city bird, something to be protected from his world. But in that moment, he saw a strength he had never anticipated. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't swooned. She had taken charge with a competence that rivaled his own. That evening, long after the doctor had come and gone, praising the clean, professional set of the bone, David found Sienna on the porch, watching the stars begin to pepper the darkening sky. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with a new, unspoken awareness. "Thank you," he said finally. The words felt foreign on his tongue. "You were good with him today. Better than I would have been." "Someone had to be," she replied softly, not looking at him. "He's just a boy. He worships you now, you know." David said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "All the men do. They're calling you the Angel of Blackwood Creek." A small smile touched Sienna's lips. "That's ridiculous. Is it?" He leaned against the porch post, the hard lines of his face softened by the twilight. "You brought order to this house. You fed them. You healed one of them. In this country, that's about as close to an angel as a man can expect to find." It was the longest, most personal conversation they had ever had. It was a small thing, a brief moment of shared experience, but it was a profound shift. He was seeing her not as Miss Vance, the signatory on his contract, but as Sienna, a woman of quiet strength and surprising depth. Later that week, he came home to find a new sturdy bookshelf in the main room, built of smooth sanded pine. On it, her small collection of books was neatly arranged. He stopped and ran a hand over the wood. He knew Jeb was handy with a saw, and he knew the old man wouldn't have done it without his approval. But Jeb had never asked. He had simply seen a need and filled it, a change spurred by Sienna's presence. David looked at the books, poetry novels, stories from a world far from his own. He thought of the empty vase on the porch rail. He walked outside, picked it up, brought it back inside, and set it on the mantelpiece. It was empty, a silent apology, and an admission of something he couldn't yet name. It was a crack in the armor, an acknowledgement that some changes he was beginning to realize might just be necessary. The fragile peace that had begun to settle over Blackwood Creek was shattered by the arrival of 3 riders. Sienna was tending to a small herb garden she had started near the kitchen door when she saw them, 3 sharp silhouettes against the bright morning sun. The man in the lead was different from the dusty, hard-working cowboys she was used to seeing. He wore a tailored black coat, a pristine Stetson, and rode a magnificent black stallion that moved with an arrogant grace. David came out onto the porch, his body instantly rigid, his hand resting casually near the Colt revolver, holstered at his hip. Jeb appeared from the barn, a pitchfork in his hand, his friendly face hardened into a mask of distrust. The rider in black dismounted with a fluid motion and swept his hat off, revealing a handsome silver-haired man with eyes as cold and grey as river stones. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by to congratulate you on your recent nuptials. It seems the old man got his wish after all." Thorne David's voice was flat, devoid of any welcome. "You're not welcome on my land." Lucas Thorne's gaze slid past David and settled on Sienna. He let his eyes travel over her, a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. And this must be the blushing bride. "My dear, you are a vision. Lucas Thorne at your service." He gave a slight, mocking bow. "I must say, David, I'm surprised. I never figured you for the marrying kind. Especially after—" "That's enough!" Thorne David cut in his voice, dropping to a dangerous growl. He took a half-step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sienna. It was a subtle protective gesture, and it did not go unnoticed by either Thorne or Sienna. Thorne chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Always so serious. I just came to be neighborly. This is a hard country. A man needs friends, and a smart man knows which friends to have." He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with a proprietary air. "Nice spread your father left you. It takes a lot to keep a place like this running. Water good grazing. It can all disappear so quickly." The veiled threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "Get off my land," David repeated, his voice now as cold and sharp as a blade. Thorne's smile finally vanished. He held David's gaze for a long moment before turning and swinging back into his saddle. "As you wish." "Ma'am." He tipped his hat to Sienna again, his eyes lingering on her one last time before he and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and unease in their wake. "Stay away from him," David said to Sienna, his back still to her, as he watched the riders disappear. "If you see him, you turn and walk away. You don't speak to him. Ever." The encounter left a dark cloud over the ranch. The men were more watchful, their easy camaraderie replaced by a quiet tension. David became even more withdrawn, spending longer hours out on the range, his face set in grim lines. 2 weeks later, the threat became real. Jeb and David rode in late one evening, their faces streaked with soot and fury. "What happened?" Sienna asked, meeting them on the porch with a lantern. "It's the north pasture," Jeb said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Someone diverted Miller's Creek, ran it right off our property and onto Thorne's land. The whole pasture is turning to dust. We'll lose 100 head of cattle if we can't get them moved to the West Range by the end of the week." "It wasn't a natural dam," David added, his fists clenched. "It was deliberate. Axe marks on the trees they used. Thorne's work." The next few days were a blur of frantic, back-breaking labor. Every able-bodied man, David included, worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, rounding up the cattle and driving them miles across the property to where there was still water and grass. The heat was oppressive, the dust relentless. Sienna refused to be a bystander. She turned the ranch house into a base of operations. She woke hours before the men, cooking massive breakfasts and packing food and canteens of water for them to take. She kept a huge pot of coffee brewing day and night. When they returned exhausted and covered in grime, she had hot meals waiting and bandages for their cuts and scrapes. She saw a different side of David. He worked harder than any of his men, leading from the front, his body powered by sheer will and a furious determination to not let Thorne win. He was a force of nature, a leader who inspired loyalty through his own sacrifice. On the third night, he stumbled into the kitchen looking ready to collapse. He hadn't really eaten in days. Sienna placed a steaming plate of stew and a fresh piece of bread in front of him. He stared at it, too tired to even lift his fork. Without a word, she sat down across from him. "You cannot save this ranch if you work yourself into the ground, David," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. He looked up, his stormy eyes clouded with exhaustion and frustration. "He's trying to bleed me dry, Sienna. He thinks he can break me." "Then you cannot let him," she said, her gaze steady. "You will eat. You will get a few hours of sleep. And tomorrow you will face him with your strength, not just your fury. Your men follow your lead. They need a commander, not a martyr." Her words, calm and logical, seemed to cut through his haze of anger. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a helper, but a partner. She was as invested in this fight as he was. She hadn't signed up for this battle against land barons and saboteurs, but she was standing her ground right beside him. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The silence between them was no longer empty or awkward. It was comfortable, filled with a shared purpose. They saved the herd, but the cost was high. The north pasture was lost for the season, and their resources were stretched thin. But something important had been forged in the crisis. David and Sienna had faced their first real threat together. They had worked as a team, relying on each other's strengths. The invisible wall between them had been breached not by a single crack, but by the force of a shared battle. He was no longer just the man whose name she had taken, and she was no longer just the woman living in his house. They were allies, and in the harsh reality of the West, sometimes that was the first step toward something much deeper. The confrontation with Thorne had changed the atmosphere in the house. The rigid lines of their arrangement had blurred. David no longer retreated to his study immediately after supper. Instead, he would linger in the main room, sometimes watching Sienna read by the firelight, other times discussing the ranch's finances with her. He was surprised by her sharp mind and practical insights. She suggested rotating pastures to allow the land to recover a new concept of land management she had read about in a book. He was skeptical at first, but the logic was undeniable. He was beginning to see her as more than just a presence. She was an asset, a confidant. One evening, a fierce autumn storm blew in, rattling the windows and trapping them inside. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the house in sheets. The men were hunkered down in the bunkhouse, leaving David and Sienna alone in the main house. The world shrunk to the warm circle of light cast by the fireplace. David was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. Sienna noticed him pause and touch a small tarnished silver locket he always wore around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. She had seen him do it before, usually in moments of stress or deep thought. It was a subconscious, protective gesture. "That locket seems important to you," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the storm. He stopped, his hands going still. He looked down at the locket, as if seeing it for the first time. Then his gaze met hers across the room. The firelight played on his face, illuminating a profound sadness in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before. For a long moment he said nothing, and she thought she had overstepped, broken their unspoken peace. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion. It was Sarah's. He didn't need to explain who Sarah was. The name hung in the air, imbued with a history of pain. He slowly opened the locket. Sienna moved closer and saw the faded miniature portrait inside. It was a young woman, barely a girl, with a bright, hopeful smile and laughing eyes. "We were going to be married," David said, his voice strained. He wasn't looking at Sienna, but at the face in the locket, lost in a memory. "I was younger then, hot-headed. I thought I knew everything about being a man. I'd just been made a deputy in a town down in the Wyoming territory. I was proud, full of myself." He took a shaky breath. "There was a gang, the Miller brothers. Vicious. They came to rob the bank. I was supposed to be on duty, but Sarah and we had taken a walk down by the river. We were talking about our future, the house we would build. By the time we heard the shots, it was too late." His eyes closed, as if to block out the image. "I ran toward the sound, told her to stay put, to hide. But she followed me. She was always worried about me. The Millers were coming out of the bank just as I rounded the corner. They had hostages. They opened fire. I returned it. It was chaos, dust and screaming. When it was over, they were gone, and she was." He couldn't finish the sentence. The pain was still too raw, a wound that had never healed. She was caught in the crossfire, a stray bullet. My stray bullet. I never knew for sure. But it doesn't matter. She was there because of me. She died because of my pride, my foolishness. I quit being a lawman that day. I buried her, and I buried that part of myself with her. I came back here and swore I would never be responsible for anyone's life, anyone's heart, ever again." He finally looked at Sienna, his eyes filled with a decade of self-loathing and grief. "So now you know, Sienna, why this house had no heart, why I wanted a wife in name only. There's nothing in here to give," he said, tapping his chest. "It died with her." The confession filled the space between them, raw and heartbreaking. Sienna didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She saw his pain, the crushing weight of guilt he had carried alone for so long. She reached out and gently placed her hand over his where it rested on the rifle. His skin was calloused, but she could feel a tremor running through him. "You have been punishing yourself for 10 years for a tragic accident," she said, her voice thick with empathy. "You honor her memory by grieving David, but you dishonor the life you have by refusing to live it. The man I have seen work this ranch, the man who protected his men, who stood between me and Lucas Thorne. That is not a man, with nothing left to give. He stared at their hands, his large, rough one partially covered by her small, delicate one. The storm raged outside, but inside the world had gone completely still. He looked from their hands to her face, her eyes shining with an understanding and compassion that he hadn't realized he was starving for. Slowly he leaned forward. She didn't pull away. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching connection. It was a release of a decade of loneliness, a silent acknowledgement of the scars they both carried. His lips were chapped and firm, and they tasted of whiskey and sorrow. When he pulled back, the air was different. The contract, the rules, the careful distance they had maintained, it had all been washed away by the storm, both outside and in. Sienna, he whispered her name, a prayer on his lips. The marriage of convenience was over. He had let her see the broken pieces of his soul, and instead of running, she had offered him not a cure, but solace. For the first time since he had pinned on a deputy's badge, David Blackwood felt a flicker of something he had long thought buried forever hope. But as the storm subsided, a new fear took root. To hope was to have something to lose, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Lucas Thorne was not done trying to take everything from him. Only now the stakes were infinitely higher. The weeks following the storm were a revelation. The walls between David and Sienna crumbled, completely replaced by a quiet, burgeoning intimacy. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, her lonely childhood spent in books, his wild youth trying to outrun his father's shadow. They became a team in every sense. She rode out with him sometimes, her laughter echoing across the valleys as he taught her to ride properly, and he found himself seeking her counsel on every decision regarding the ranch. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a home filled with warmth and the unspoken promise of a future. This newfound happiness made David both whole and terrified. He had something precious to lose again, and the shadow of Lucas Thorne loomed ever larger. Thorne had been quiet since the creek diversion, too quiet. David knew it was the calm before a far more violent storm. The storm broke on a crisp October morning. David and most of the hands were miles away on the West Range, rounding up strays before the first snow. Only Jeb and 2 young hands, including Billy, remained at the homestead. Sienna was in her garden, humming softly to herself, when she felt the hair on her arms stand up. A sense of being watched prickled at her skin. She looked up to see Thorne and 4 of his men riding slowly toward the house. They weren't riding with purpose. They were swaggering, confident, like wolves, circling their prey. Thorne's smile was wider and more malevolent than ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he called out, dismounting. "A lovely day. Is the man of the house around?" "He is not, Sienna," said her voice, betraying none of her fear. She stood up, dusting the dirt from her hands. Jeb came out of the barn, his face grim, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "Well now, Jebediah, there's no need for that," Thorne said with a dismissive wave. "This is a social call." He took a step closer to Sienna. "You see, your husband has been uncooperative. He refuses to see reason. I've made him fair offers for this land, but he's as stubborn as his old man was." "This land is not for sale," Sienna said firmly. Thorne's eyes hardened. "Everything is for sale, my dear. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Since he won't listen to offers of money, I've decided to make a trade." In a flash, his men moved. 2 of them grabbed Jeb, disarming him with brutal efficiency. The other 2 seized Sienna. She cried out as a rough hand clamped over her mouth. "I'm taking his most prized possession." Thorne sneered, his face close to hers. "Let's see how much this ranch is worth to him, when his pretty little wife is the asking price." "Billy!" he yelled toward the bunkhouse. "You ride out and find your boss. Tell him Lucas Thorne has his wife at the old abandoned silver mine up on Whisperwind Ridge. If he wants to see her alive again, he comes alone. And he brings the deed to this ranch, signed over to me." Billy, pale with terror, stumbled out, and with a fearful glance at Sienna ran for a horse. Thorne threw Sienna over the front of his saddle, and with his men holding Jeb at gunpoint, they rode out, heading for the jagged ridges in the distance. It took Billy 3 hours of frantic riding to find David. The moment the boy choked out the message, the quiet rancher vanished. In his place stood the man he had buried 10 years ago. Deputy Blackwood, cold-focused and lethal. His eyes became chips of ice. He gave swift, precise orders to his men, sending half of them to circle around the ridge from the north and the other half to secure the homestead and free Jeb. "What are you going to do, boss?" one of his men asked, seeing the terrifying look on his face. "I'm going to end this," David said, checking his revolver and sliding his father's Winchester rifle into his saddle scabbard. He was following Thorne's instructions. He would go alone. But he wouldn't be bringing a deed. He would be bringing a reckoning. At the abandoned mine, Sienna was shoved into a dark, dusty shack. Thorne paced outside like a caged animal, high on his own power. Sienna, however, was not a passive victim. Her mind raced. She was terrified, but her fear sharpened her senses. She noticed a loose board near the back of the shack and a pile of rusty mining equipment in the corner. When David appeared at the mouth of the canyon leading to the mine, he was a solitary figure against the setting sun. He rode slowly, one hand raised to show he was empty. "Thorne," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I'm here, let her go." Thorne emerged from the main mine entrance, dragging Sienna with him, a pistol pressed to her temple. "The deed, Blackwood. Or she dies right here. The deed is in my saddlebag," David said, his voice calm, betraying none of the rage boiling inside him. "Let her walk to me, and it's yours." "I'm not a fool," Thorne laughed. "Toss it over." As they were distracted, Sienna acted. With all her might, she stomped down on Thorne's instep with her boot heel. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She shoved him away and scrambled for cover behind a stack of old timbers. That was David's signal. In a movement so fast it was a blur, he drew his Colt and fired, not at Thorne, but at one of his men perched on the rocks above who was taking aim. The man tumbled down with a cry. The canyon erupted into chaos. David threw himself from his horse, using it for cover, as he fired again, his shots, precise and deadly. Thorne's men, overconfident and not expecting a fight, were caught off guard. From the ridges above, David's own men opened fire, pinning them down. Thorne, enraged, grabbed Sienna again and dragged her toward the mine shaft. "It's over, Blackwood. You'll never see her again." David ran after them, dodging bullets. He followed them into the suffocating darkness of the mine. He could hear Sienna struggling ahead. He rounded a corner in the tunnel and saw them. Thorne was trying to back away, using Sienna as a shield. It didn't have to be this way, David Thorne yelled, his voice manic in the enclosed space. This land should have been mine. Just then, Sienna, who had managed to palm a small, sharp piece of rock during her scramble, drove it backward into Thorne's side. He howled his pistol, firing wildly, the shot ricocheting off the rock walls. He shoved her hard, and she fell. Now it was just the two men. In the dim light, David saw the ghost of Sarah, felt the old guilt rise. But this time was different. He wasn't fighting out of pride or for a law he barely believed in. He was fighting for the woman who had brought his heart back to life. Thorne lunged. The fight was brutal, primal. It ended with David's pistol firmly in his hand and Thorne on the ground, beaten and disarmed. David didn't kill him. He hauled Thorne out of the mine, into the light where the surviving men had surrendered. He handed him over to his foreman. Take him to the marshal in Promise Creek. See that he hangs for kidnapping and attempted murder." Then he turned and rushed to Sienna, who was sitting up, bruised and shaken, but alive. He knelt before her, his hands framing her face, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tightly, the solid, living warmth of her chasing away the last of the ghosts from his past. Holding her there amidst the dust and gunpowder, he knew his life hadn't just been changed. It had been reborn. The capture of Lucas Thorne sent a wave of relief through Promise Creek. His reign of intimidation was over, and the truth of his crimes, sabotage, cattle rustling, and finally kidnapping, cemented the Blackwoods, not just as landowners, but as pillars of the community. David's decisive action, a blend of his past as a lawman and his present as a protector of his home, earned him a new level of respect from his neighbors. But for David, the only respect that truly mattered was the quiet look of pride in his wife's eyes. In the peaceful weeks that followed, the ranch healed. The rhythm of life returned, but it was a new rhythm, one set to the beat of two hearts instead of one. The empty spaces in the large house were now filled with shared glances, soft conversations, and easy laughter. The separate bedrooms at the end of the hall were a distant memory. Their marriage of convenience had blossomed into a partnership so deep and true that neither of them could imagine a life before it. One crisp, clear afternoon, as the aspens on the mountainside turned a brilliant gold, David asked Sienna to go for a ride. He didn't tell her where they were going. He led her up a winding trail to a high meadow overlooking the entire ranch. From there, the valley stretched out below them, like a map, the winding creek, the sturdy house, and barns, the vast pastures, where their cattle grazed peacefully. It was a kingdom built of sweat, blood, and perseverance. They dismounted and walked to the edge of the bluff. The wind tugged at Sienna's hair, and she leaned into David's side, feeling the steady strength of his arm around her. "My father used to bring me up here," David said, his voice soft. "He'd tell me that the land wasn't something we owned. We were just its caretakers. He said a man's real legacy wasn't the acreage he held, but the life he built on it." He turned to face her, his stormy eyes clear and full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Sienna Vance," he began, his voice thick. "I brought you here under false pretenses. I offered you a contract, a business deal. I gave you my name, a roof over your head, and a promise to leave you alone. I was a fool, a broken man hiding in the shell of his father's legacy." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. It wasn't fancy, just a thin band of gold, but it shone brightly in the afternoon sun. It was his mother's wedding ring, which he had quietly retrieved from a locked box in his study. "I didn't know that I wasn't just saving my ranch. I was saving myself," he continued, his gaze locked on hers. "You walked into my empty life, and you filled it with light and strength and courage. You made this house a home. You made me whole. This marriage may have started with a lawyer's signature, but I want it to continue with a promise from the heart." He knelt on one knee in the soft grass of the meadow, holding the ring up to her. "Sienna Blackwood, my wife, my partner, my heart. Will you marry me for real this time? Will you build a life with me on this land? Not as its caretaker, but as its queen." Tears welled in Sienna's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not the cold, distant rancher she had first met. but the strong, honorable, loving man he had allowed himself to become. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. Oh, David, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood and pulled her into a deep, loving kiss, sealing their true beginning right there under the vast Montana sky, with their entire world spread out at their feet. The contract had given her his name, but his heart had given her a home. He had offered her a marriage of convenience, never knowing that in saving her, she would give him a life far richer than any land or legacy, a life of love forever and always. Their story began not with a promise of love, but with a cold, hard bargain, born of desperation. He needed a signature to save his ranch. She needed an escape to save her life. What started as an empty arrangement in the rugged heart of the West became a journey of healing and redemption. They battled land barons, ghosts of the past, and the stubborn walls they had built around their own hearts. Through hardship and danger, David and Sienna discovered that the most binding contracts aren't written on paper, but are forged in the fires of loyalty, respect, and a love that neither of them ever expected to find. Their tale reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful futures are built on the most broken foundations, and that a home is truly made by the person you choose to share it with. If their epic journey from strangers to soulmates touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a timeless romance, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of love, danger, and destiny in the Wild West.